Sorry for the delay. Couple things before we jump into material. That quiz from yesterday, I put up an announcement. I gave you what the correct value that it's accepting is if you kind of watched that video or you were here live. Once that due date has passed, I'm going to go in and just make sure, even if I don't know, for whatever reason, didn't quite get it entered correct, I'm going to give everybody credit for that third question. I just can't do it until that due date passes on Sunday. After today's class, so we'll have this participation quiz from today, but we'll also have that next module 10 quiz pop up. That'll be due at the end of the day, Sunday. I've got the next module 11's materials already up there. That module reading for module 11 is due before we start class tomorrow. You can see the module 12 is due before we start class Friday. That's already up there as well. Something someone asked about that I will try to have by the time we start class tomorrow, but I'll try to get together like a figure out your grade tool kind of thing. I know there's a built-in one in Canvas. It doesn't quite work as well with the fact that I drop your lowest two quizzes, etc. So I'll kind of walk through that tomorrow. I should have that file kind of ready to go. Other than that, so not wasting too much more of your time here, and kind of hop right into material unless there's any logistical questions for me before we get going here. Okay. All right. So we left off last class kind of talking about this idea of firms choosing their profit maximizing quantity. And at that profit maximizing quantity, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, if the price, the current equilibrium price, we're in perfectly competitive markets, so every firm is a price taker. If that equilibrium price is above our average total cost, we said profits were positive. If it ever falls below our average total cost, we then are at negative profits, and we have an additional decision, which is do we stay open or shut down? So the idea there was if the price is above kind of our additional per unit cost by staying open, then the additional benefit of selling the good is greater than the additional cost. We should stay open to minimize our losses. If that price ever falls below those additional variable per unit variable costs, then we're actually better off just shutting down, our profits there being negative fixed costs. So we'll return to this at the end of the class. I've got a little Excel example that'll kind of walk us through this. But remember, we said for any price that's above average variable cost, right, that minimum point, we know that the firm is going to choose to stay open. So if we're thinking about kind of our short run supply curve here, it's going to look a little bit different. Usually we would have like our marginal costs going down here and we had gains from specialization. But at any point below the minimum point of our average variable cost, if the price ever falls below that, what should the firm do? It should just shut down and produce zero. Right? So let's kind of give a little bit of a different look, insight into why that is. We said typically we were thinking about we had our marginal cost curve. It hits the average variable cost at its minimum point, right? And then we could even put in our average total cost curve. It hits it at its minimum point. So anytime the price is in this range, right? So we're thinking about different prices here. That price would represent the marginal revenue of the firm. That hits marginal cost at a quantity where that price is above our average variable cost. So we said any point above that minimum point of the average cost, if the price is above that, we know we're going to be at a point where price is above average variable, and we actually should stay open to minimize our losses. So as the price goes up, right, the quantity that we choose to produce will get higher and higher. So here was kind of our, based off of our marginal cost, this was like the firm's supply curve. Now, for any price below that minimum point, what's true about the optimal profit maximizing quantity, or where does marginal revenue now hit marginal cost? It's at these quantities where the price is actually below our average variable, in which case, if that's true, we said we should shut down. So for any price in this range, we shouldn't be operating, we shouldn't be producing these quantities. We should actually just be producing zero, right? Which is why kind of our short run supply curve is for any price in this range will produce nothing. As soon as the price goes above that minimum point of the average variable cost, now it looks just like we've had before, where we have these increasing marginal costs. Okay, so that's kind of where that short run cost curve comes from, right? And we kind of talked a little bit about last class, but here's just to, seeing it in a slightly different way. Okay, I don't want this to go away. Go away up here. There we go. So today we're going to talk about a little bit more about the differences between the firm's supply curve and then our market or our industry supply curve. Right? So when we were looking at the firm's supply curve, that was helping us choose the quantity that the firm would be choosing. But the market supply, right, would be how much each firm is supplying and then add them all up. Right? So typically we think about this short run industry market supply curve. We know that no firm is going to produce anything if that price is ever below that minimum point of the average variable cost. And one thing we're going to start, also be assuming in this module is in a perfectly competitive market, all firms face the same cost structure. So all firms have the same minimum point of their average variable cost. Okay. Oh, there we go. So what'll end up being true in our short run market equilibrium is the quantity supplied is going to be equal to the quantity demanded. So nothing is going to kind of change there. But what we're also assuming is when we see these changes, or we think we have a change in the price, and firms are choosing the optimal quantity, we're assuming, or we have been assuming, that the number of firms has stayed the same. So today we'll talk about what happens if it doesn't, right? And why it won't. So in the long run, right, we're going to end up with the same kind of thing we had from module 3, that in the long run, quantity supplied will always be equal to quantity demanded in the market. And that's only if we have, or we allow for, free entry and exit of firms. So it'll look very similar to what we talked about in module 3 if we allow firms to enter and exit these markets when we're looking at the long run. In the short run, it'll look a little bit different. Okay. So we'll start to think about why would firms enter or exit a market, and then we'll kind of walk through some examples. So let's assume we started out with a situation where the price was above our average total cost. Whatever that profit maximizing quantity was, it resulted in positive profits. Okay. And just kind of a reminder where that comes from, or another way to kind of easily see that, we said our profit equation was the quantity that the firm is producing times the difference between their price and average total cost. So when price was above average total cost, profits would have to be positive. Anytime price was below average total, there our profits were negative. Okay. So if price is above our average total cost and we have positive profits, well, what are firms going to do? Well, the existing firms, they've already chosen the optimal profit maximizing quantity. But if I see that other firms are making money selling a product, what do I want to do? I want to produce that product as well. Right? So, you could pick or choose whatever good you're thinking of. I think about sometimes when like new goods pop up, like dumb things like fidget spinners, right? They had a fad for a while. Well, people were making positive profits. What did we see? A bunch of companies started making them, right? So once there's positive profits in a market in the short run, we'll see that firms start to enter that market. As they enter that market, they're going to shift the supply curve. I introduced this idea last class thinking about, well, what could cause a shift in supply if we have a higher number of producers or more firms enter that market. As more firms enter the market, supply increases. What's that going to do to our equilibrium price? It's going to push it down. So this is where the class isn't cumulative, but it's comprehensive in the sense like we keep building on things, right? So we talked about supply shifts way back in module 3, I think. And anytime supply increases, that will push that equilibrium price down. Well, think about what's going to happen. If I start out with positive profits, if firms enter and it pushes the price down, price is going to be getting closer to average total cost. So this is going to push my profits closer to 0. Okay. And then what if prices were below the average total cost? Well, if I have negative profits, what do you think firms are going to do? In the long run, you can't hemorrhage money forever. So maybe in the short run, it makes sense to stay open to kind of minimize your losses. But over time, firms will start to leave that industry. As they leave or firms exit, that would kind of decrease our supply curve, or looks like a shift upward. What does that do? increases the equilibrium price. If price is below average total cost, as price goes up, this is getting closer to average total cost until we get profits that are close to zero. Okay. So anytime we have positive profits, firms will enter that market, decrease that equilibrium price, kind of lowering those profits towards zero. Once profits are zero, there's no longer any incentive for any firm to now enter this market or to leave. Same kind of idea. If price is below average total, negative profits, firms will start to exit. That decreases market supply, which will then increase the equilibrium price up until the point where price is equal to average total cost. Now I've got profits equal to zero. Now there's no incentive for any firm to enter or exit this market in this scenario as well. So it doesn't matter if we start out with short run positive or negative profits. We know that firms will enter and exit, and those behaviors will push the price, towards that long run equilibrium, which is where profits are equal to zero. So I'll kind of give you a visual depiction of this in the slides. I'll then draw one out for you that does something a little bit different. So let's say we started out and we had positive economic profits. Okay. So I've got my positive profits here from the original price. If there's positive, I look at that equilibrium price, that's my marginal revenue, hits marginal cost at a quantity where that price is above average total cost. So this blue rectangle, we said, represents my positive profits, because what's the width? Well, that's just the quantity the firm is producing, times what's the height? Well, that's just the difference between the price and the average total cost. Price is above average total cost, those will be positive profits. So what will happen is firms will start to enter this market. As they enter, that increases my supply curve, or a rightward shift in supply, pushes my equilibrium price and quantity, right? My price is going down, the equilibrium quantity in the market is actually going up. Okay. So as firms enter, I think the intuitive result is that, oh yeah, as firms enter this market, we get more, right, of this unit at our equilibrium point. We have a higher equilibrium quantity. Now there's also more firms, so there's more competition. We see that the equilibrium price is lower. At this lower equilibrium price, firms enter until at this new price, our marginal revenue is, now that equilibrium price is equal to marginal cost at the minimum point of our average total cost curve. Price being equal to average total cost, that means that at this new profit maximizing quantity, what would profits for the firm be here? Zero. So if we started out with positive economic profits, firms will enter this market until they push the price down low enough to where profits are now zero. Now there's no incentive for any firm to enter or exit the market. All right. So that's kind of one scenario. The second scenario would be, well, let's say we start out with negative profits. Right? What is this going to look like? Well, at that current price, marginal revenue hits the marginal cost at this lower quantity. Excuse me. That price is below average total cost. So we now know this rectangle is going to represent profits, but they will be negative because the price, or my per unit revenues, are below my per unit costs. What will firms do if we have negative profits? Over time, you can't hemorrhage money forever. They start to exit. This decreases our supply curve, which would then increase our equilibrium price and decrease that market quantity. At this higher price, where is the marginal revenue of the firm now? Well, now it hits marginal cost at a higher quantity, and right, that price will raise until firms continue to exit, until now profits are equal to zero, or my price is exactly equal to my average total cost. All right, so it doesn't matter if we start it with positive or negative profits, firms will enter or exit until we get these long run profits where there's no incentive for a firm to enter or exit any longer, and profits are equal to zero. Okay. So I want to mention a couple things in this scenario. So when we had positive profits, somewhat of a counterintuitive result. So this depiction on the left is the market. The depiction on the right is the firm. So each firm, when I see firms enter, they produced a lower quantity. Why? Well, because for every quantity in this range, before, the additional revenue was greater than the additional costs. However, once that price is lower, for every quantity in this range, the additional revenue is now below the additional cost for those units. So it's no longer profitable for the firm to produce those. So when firms enter, each existing firm will actually produce less. However, how does the quantity in the market actually go up? Simple numerical example. Let's say I started out with 2 firms, each is producing 100. My total market quantity would be 200. If a third firm enters because there were positive profits, maybe now each firm is only going to produce 75 units. But if I have 3 firms, 3 times 75, that would actually be a total quantity in the market of 225, which was higher than 200. So when firms enter, each firm will choose a lower profit maximizing quantity, but because there's more firms, we'll end up with a market quantity that's greater than that, or at least in the scenarios that we'll talk about. Okay. And then same kind of idea with negative profits. If firms exit, well, as firms exit, there are now units where at the old price, the additional revenue was below the additional costs, but now at the higher price, the additional revenue is greater than the additional costs. So we see each firm actually produces a little bit more when firms exit, but because we're having firms exit, if we take the quantity of each firm times the number of firms, we're going to get a reduction in the market quantity. So kind of highlighting there when we're thinking about, and I try to use uppercase Q for the market, lowercase q for the firm, but you can almost think about like the quantity that you see in the market will be the quantity that each firm chooses times the number of firms that we have. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So in the long run, right, we're going to end up with firms entering and exiting until that profit is equal to 0, but the price or our marginal revenue is hitting our marginal cost at the lowest possible short run average total cost curve, right? So we're also going to have a long run average total cost curve, which is representing that, okay, firms not only can enter and exit, but also they can change fixed factors of production. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Okay. So we talked, let me see if my animation, oh, okay. So we talked about this in module 9, but remember, we could change things that were fixed in the short run if we had enough time. So this is like choosing different production facilities. We said if by increasing quantity, we move to these larger production facilities, if it's lowering our short run average total cost, we said there we had economies of scale. And then at a certain point, if we continue to choose higher, larger and larger production facilities, well, their increasing quantity eventually might put us on higher short run average total cost curves. The minimum of all those short run average total cost curves was our long run average total cost curve. So in the long run, what will be true is firms will enter and exit until all of these things were at the lowest point of our short run average total cost curve, lowest point of our long run average total cost curve. Everything is essentially equal at this point, and our profits are equal to 0. Okay. Now, this only occurs if we have free entry and exit of these firms. Otherwise, we could end up on short run average total cost curves where profits are positive or negative, or vice versa. Okay. All right. So what happens if we see changes in demand? So I'm going to start out with one that isn't in the slides, and then I'll have one in the slides that kind of might help us. I don't know. Probably easier to then look at the one in the slides if I work through one by hand. So let's say I've got, let me think if I want to do this all in one graph. But we got to walk before we can run here. No, we don't. I think this will help change my mind sometimes. So let's say I'm thinking about, I've got the quantity that the firm is choosing. I've got the total quantity in the market. And let's say originally, I've got my supply curve. I've got my demand curve. And here is the current equilibrium price. we know that that will be the firm's demand curve or their marginal revenue curve. Okay. We then would have some marginal cost curve. And let's just start out with a scenario where they were currently earning zero economic profits. So I've got an average total cost curve here. Marginal revenue is hitting marginal cost at this optimal profit maximizing quantity for the firm, where what? Price is equal to average total cost. So my profits are equal to zero. Okay. Let's assume that there's a change in the market, right? So for whatever reason, we see that maybe it was like fidget spinners. All of a sudden, people realize they're very dumb. I don't need them in my life. Or there's just a decrease, this could be a change in income, right? Maybe it's a normal good, I have less income. So we would see a demand decrease, right? So if we had a demand decrease, what is that going to do to my equilibrium price? Well, I could actually even think about the quantity as well in the market. So it's going to push down that equilibrium quantity, also push down that equilibrium price. Notice if this is the new price, what's my new demand curve or the marginal revenue curve of the firm? Well, it's going to be that new price. So marginal revenue is going to have to hit marginal cost now at a lower quantity. What is now true at this quantity? My price is below average total cost, right? I guess I should have put 2 here. We didn't change the total cost. But my profits in this second scenario would then be negative. Okay. So if we see a demand decrease, initially that's going to push the price down. It's going to lower the quantity that each firm produces. Okay. So when I have this demand decrease, that pushed my equilibrium price lower, which was the marginal revenue of the firm, which then resulted in the quantity each firm produces also going down. Okay. So that's probably about like what I would ask you in one question. I would probably end it there. Like what would the result of a demand decrease, right? But once that happens, what's going to be true about profits? Well, we just said price is below average total cost at this quantity. So I end up with these negative profits. So what are firms going to do? So this was in the short run. I have this demand change. In the long run, in response to that, will firms enter or exit this market? Firms are going to exit if profits are negative. So I'm going to see a supply decrease, right? And they're going to exit as long as the cost structure of these firms hasn't changed. And I'll use colors, but I'm also going to say like this is like initial demand decrease was kind of scenario 2. Now, in response to that, I'm getting a exit of firms. Where's my new equilibrium price? Well, that change has pushed it right here. Okay. So notice I get this large reduction in the market quantity. Why? Because when the demand went down, prices were lower, so each firm produced less. But then with these new negative profits, now not only is each firm producing less, a bunch of firms exit this market until the price is back to whatever it was before. So now this is like marginal revenue in the third. Now I'm back to each firm is producing the same optimal kind of profit maximizing quantity, right? The price gets back to what it was before, right? Profits are equal to zero now again. But what's happened to the market quantity? It's went down by a lot. So in the long run, yes, even when there's like short run demand shifts, it'll cause short-term negative or positive profits we'll look at in a second. It might change the quantity the firm produces in the short run, but in the long run, because of firm entry and exit, we end up with firms producing the same quantity, having zero profits, but there's fewer firms, so the quantity in the market is going to be lower. Any questions on anything there? Okay. So I've got the flip side scenario in the slides, and this is really kind of a similar thing. Um, oh, and just to be complete, just to kind of give you some shorthand. So in response to this, what happened? Supply decreased. That pushed the equilibrium price back up. And then the quantity of the firm also went back up. Okay. So if instead I think about what if I had a demand increase, right? So let's say I start out with this scenario where I get this off the screen. And I'm initially starting out at that minimum point of our average total cost curve, a price of 14, and profits would be equal to 0. Right? So this is like how much each firm is producing. Here is my total market quantity. So just that quantity times the number of firms. And then I'm thinking about what happens to those existing firms, not from the increase in demand, but once firms start to enter the market. So when we said demand decreased, caused profits to be negative, firms exited. So you can kind of imagine if demand increases, well, what is that going to do? The initial increase in demand will push the equilibrium price up. So that initial increase in demand is going to increase the quantity in the market, push the price higher. Why? Because each firm, they now face this higher price, right? They can charge a higher price. They are now at a quantity where the price is above average total, so they're earning positive profits. So initially, when the price goes up because of a demand increase, now firms have price above average total cost. They'd have positive profits. However, once there's positive profits, what do firms in this market do? Well, they start to enter. So we see a supply increase until the price is pushed back down to this minimum point of our average total cost curve. Profits are now back to 0. Whereas my new equilibrium, it's at the same price as before, but the market quantity has went up. So the exact opposite effect that we had from a demand decrease. So in the short run, with a demand increase, we can have positive profits, but as firms enter that market, it'll push our profits back down to 0. However, the long run effects of that demand increase will be we see a higher market quantity. Okay? And that's because we have a higher number of firms, right, that joined in response to those short run positive economic profits. Okay. And I've got kind of the shorthand down here for that. So we kind of worked through both scenarios: demand increase, demand decrease. If I won't ask you a lot of questions on this, but just to kind of be complete in our discussion, one thing if we're thinking about the short run versus the long run is, and we talked about back in module 4, elasticity is not the same thing as slope, but they're closely related. So a completely horizontal supply curve would mean that suppliers are perfectly elastic, right? They're very responsive. Inelastic would be vertical. So the steeper the supply curve, the more inelastic that would be. So in the short run, we're locked into like lease agreements or contracts. And so in the short run, we can't be as responsive. In the long run, we can be a lot more responsive to price changes. In fact, what's the most responsive we can be? We can enter or exit the market. Not only can we change these different factors of production, we can actually respond to that price of the good by either entering or exiting the market, which is going to have even larger impacts on the quantity we see in that market. So our long run industry supply curve is going to be a lot flatter than our short run supply curve. Okay. We already talked through kind of this idea. The next thing that I want to kind of go through some examples of, because it is a little bit tricky, is going to be, all right, we can see demand increases or decreases, and that's going to have some short run impacts on profits. What if instead we think about firms being able to change fixed factors of production? So I'll start out with an easier one first, and then we'll go back to the slides. Okay. So let's assume I'm thinking about the quantity of the firm, got dollars here. I've got price, which is their marginal revenue. I've got my initial marginal cost. And let's start out actually to kind of really amplify or really show this effect. Let's say we start out with an average total cost curve, something like this. So initially, where's the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So the optimal quantity for the firm initially is at a point where what? Price is below my average total cost. So my profits are going to be negative. So this area would represent my profits because the width is the quantity I'm selling. The height is the difference between price and average total cost. Okay. So I'm starting out with these negative profits. What if I could lower, let's say I can't change my marginal cost, like my whatever, production process I'm using, I'm choosing the best production process that has the lowest possible marginal costs. But let's say I'm able to eliminate some fixed costs. So maybe I took out like these huge loans to start my business. I've now paid them off. They used to be something that I had to pay every single month, a fixed cost, no matter if I produced zero or a positive amount. I've now eliminated, I've paid those loans off. What have I done? Well, if I've lowered my fixed costs, what I've essentially done is I've lowered. Now, I try to draw this kind of parallel. I didn't do the perfect job, but you get the idea. I've lowered my average total cost. Haven't changed my marginal cost. I've just eliminated. So if we're thinking about what this is kind of depicting, this is if I could eliminate some of my fixed cost in the long run. So if I'm able to do this, nothing else has changed in the market. So where does my marginal revenue equal my marginal cost now? The exact same point. So I end up with, oh, the optimal quantity of the firm is now the same. However, what is now true? That price hasn't changed, but my average total cost has. So price is now above my average total cost. If I'm able to eliminate some of these fixed costs, right, I could actually go from negative profits to, well, where's price equal to marginal revenue here? Okay. Now I've got positive economic profits. Now, if my marginal cost hasn't changed at all, right, my short run profits from eliminating some of those fixed costs, I might actually now be able to have positive short run profits. Okay. Well, if that's the case, if other firms can mimic whatever I've done to eliminate those fixed costs, what's going to happen? If there's positive profits, what will firms now do? Enter this market, right? So firms are going to enter this market. What's going to happen? The price would actually start to go down until in the long run. So firms enter, this pushes the equilibrium price down until we kind of have this third scenario where now the quantity each firm produces is actually going to be a little bit lower, and we're back down to zero profit. So as long as we have firm entry and exit, even if we can change or eliminate some of our fixed costs, yes, in the short run, we might be able to enjoy for a year or two some positive economic profits, but over time, as firms are able to enter this market, also avoiding those same fixed costs, we're going to get back down to the point where profits are equal to zero. Okay. This is kind of an extreme, I guess, in a way scenario, but it's like if my marginal costs stay the same, but I eliminate some of my fixed costs. I shouldn't say extreme. It's kind of just a weird one. What's probably a little bit more, and here I've got a typo that I'll change now, and I forgot to update the slides. Can't have two marginal cost curves, so we have one and we have two, right? So let's say instead of just changing my fixed costs, let's say I'm able to change a fixed factor of production. So if we go back to thinking about building size, if I'm able to choose larger production facilities so that I'm ending up on a lower average total cost and a lower marginal cost curve. So if I start out in this scenario where profits are equal to zero, but I'm then able to change a fixed factor of production, end up in a lower average total cost and a lower marginal cost curve, what's going to happen here? Well, initially, where would marginal cost now be equal to marginal revenue? It's going to be out here. So notice why. For every unit in this range, before the additional revenue was less than my additional costs. With this newer lower cost structure, for all of these units, the additional revenue is now above the additional costs. So we'll see that the firm will want to produce a higher quantity than they were before. Now, what could also be true in the short run, firms haven't entered or exited yet. When firms change or choose the fixed factor production that changes their cost structure that they face, now the price is above average total cost. Now what's true about my profits? Well, now they're positive. So whether I can eliminate a fixed cost or whether I can change a fixed factor of production that lowers both my average total and marginal costs, we see that the quantity the firm chooses here is going to actually be higher than it was before. But both of those resulted in having now positive profits. The only problem is, if profits are positive, what's going to happen here? Firms are going to enter. That's going to lower the price until, in fact, I could add one in here instead of drawing it out. Okay. So this is going to be like so once we have those positive profits, firms start to enter. That pushes down the equilibrium price until we now end up at a optimal quantity for the firm where profits are back to zero. So even though we can enjoy these kind of positive profits in the short run, the story, you're probably getting tired of me. I'm saying this a lot and over, but in the long run, if you get asked a question about the long run, profits should always be zero in a perfectly competitive market. Okay. As long as firms can enter and exit freely, we'll always end up at a point where profits are equal to zero. Okay. So just to kind of put some conclusion stuff here, and then I'll work through some additional problems. I think that'll maybe kind of give us a slightly different view of this. One thing we're assuming in all of these, and I mentioned this earlier, but we're assuming that all firms face the exact same cost structures. If they don't, things get a lot more complicated. We're not going to dive into those issues. We're assuming everyone faces the same average total and marginal costs. We're also assuming that the long run, right, firms have enough time to respond to price changes and they can exit and enter the market, which we've shown will always push these profits down to zero. And this could be, they could respond to demand changes. They could respond to cost changes. As long as they can be responsive, have enough time to be responsive and change their production decision or change whether or not they are staying in or leaving a market, we always end up with these long run profits of zero. And then also in the long run, there's going to be no mutually beneficial transaction that goes unexploited. So we kind of think about it this way. Anytime someone is able to lower their costs, right? Someone else that could cause some positive profits. We're always going to assume that if there are positive profits, firms will join. They're going to, when they enter that market, maybe they can also get short run positive profits. But what are they going to do? As they enter the market, they push the price down. They're going to decrease the profits of existing firms. So there's no mutually beneficial outcome when we look at firm entry and exit. When firms enter a market, right, they're going to be taking away some profits from the existing firms. Okay. All right. So figured we'd get through this stuff kind of quick. And so what I wanted to do for the remainder of class is go through some practice problems. So I want to go through a set here, and then I've got an Excel file that I want to take some time with as well. So I think we'll actually get through just about as much material as we did in my first section. If we don't get through something, I'll kind of mention what that is, and then you'll have that in the video that I posted. Well, I'll post the other sections video along with this one. So this is going to go back a little bit to things that we talked about last class, but it's things that I want to make sure I emphasize. And they also will then help us out thinking about some of these future questions that are more related to what we were talking about today with firm entry and exit. So let's just think about, to begin with, question 8. Okay. So I'm told that when the price is 40, right? I'm just going to jot these things down before I switch off here, that we've got an optimal profit maximizing quantity of 200 for the firm. We've got total fixed costs of 5,000, and I have total variable costs of 5,000. Okay. If this is true, are we going to have negative, positive, zero profits, or will the firm choose to shut down? Okay. So if this is all the information I'm given, I can actually answer that question, right? So if I think about anytime I'm thinking about a firm's decision, right? The price, well, that's an easy one. Whatever that price is, that's the firm's marginal revenue. Okay. Now, I don't know exactly where it's at, but I know that there will be some marginal cost curve, right? And now, in order to determine where this price is at relative to my averages, well, I know that the quantity I'm at, I was told profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is at 200. At that quantity, what is my average variable costs? Well, average variable cost would just be my total variable cost over quantity. So here I'd have what? 5,000 over 200 or 25. So I know that my average variable costs at this quantity of 200 is something below that price and below my marginal costs, because I know at the optimal quantity, price, marginal revenue, marginal costs are all the same thing. So I was told that my average variable cost, this quantity, I wasn't given the average, but I was given the total. I kind of computed this was 25. Now, what about my average total cost? Well, that will be my total cost over quantity. What would my total cost be? Well, there, it's my total variable plus my total fixed cost. So I'd have what? 5,000 plus 5,000 over 200. So I think if I do math in my head correct here, that should be at 50. So at this quantity, the point that I'm at on my average total cost curve, I'll kind of draw this extreme, but my average total cost is 50 at this point. Okay. So if I'm thinking about here, I think the actual question was what? Do I have, so in the short run, this quantity, 200 bicycles firm. Oh yeah, what we're talking, we're interested in profits here. Okay. So if my current price is below average total cost, what should be true about my profits? They would be, well, remember our profit equation was simply quantity the firm is producing times the difference between price and average total. So if the price is below my average total, I know that this would represent my profits, but average total cost is above the price. So there my profits would be negative. However, I know they'll stay open because as long as price is above my average variable costs, I should stay open. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So instead, what if I looked at question 9? Let's say the price was instead 20. Okay. So if the price here, everything else stayed the same, but my equilibrium price was down here at 20. Okay. So, and let's assume, I'd have to shift these things a little bit, but at this lower price, really what do we care about? Well, that price is now below my average variable cost. So we can start to think about if price is below my average variable cost, we said if I shut down, my profits would be what? Simply negative whatever my fixed costs are. So in our example, our fixed costs were 5,000, so I'd be losing $5,000. Now, if they stay open, profits would be equal to the quantity they are producing minus the difference between price and average total cost. Well, we were told at this new price of 20, the profit maximizing quantity, if it was still 200 and our average total cost was still 50, what would the value of profits be if I stay open at this new price? Well, here I'd have what? 30 times 200, so negative 30, sorry, times 200, so negative 6,000. Sure enough, if I stayed open when price is below average variable costs, my losses would be greater than if I just shut down. So this kind of helps us see, hopefully, like that shutdown rule will lead us to the profits that aren't quite as large of a negative value. So a little bit of a step back there, thinking about these things from last class. Excuse me. Now, one thing we'll also want to make sure we get through today before we end, and this will be just more problems for us to work through, but looks a little bit more like what we were doing today. Excuse me, is the participation quiz. So let's look at these problems. So the first one says, let's assume we currently have 10 firms and they're each earning zero economic profits. Okay, so if they have a product that has an increase in demand, what's going to happen to short run profits for those existing firms in the short run? And the quantity each firm produces will do what? Okay. So we kind of already worked through one like this in the slides, but this is a good opportunity for us to draw one out. So here we're just interested in the firm. So if I've got my initial price and marginal revenue, I then have my marginal cost. And I was told originally that each firm was producing at a quantity such that the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, I was told that at whatever this quantity is, profits were equal to zero. Okay. So if I see a demand increase, right, what is that going to do? Well, this just goes back to module 3. If I've got supply and demand, if I see a demand increase, what did that do to my equilibrium price? It increased it. So if my equilibrium price goes up, what's going to happen relative to when the firms had zero profits? The marginal revenue is going to equal marginal cost. It has to be now at a higher quantity. Right? The price is now above average total cost. So that would mean my new profits would have to be positive. Right? So I went from zero profits to some positive amount of profits. So the quantity that each firm produces from a demand increase would go up. And then the short run profits would also be equal, would also have to then increase. So I should see, right, increase in quantity and an increase in their profits. Or I might have done these flip-flopped, but increase in profits and increase in quantity. Now, this isn't part of the question, but what if this question asked you about long run profits of the firm? Well, even though I had this initial demand increase, in the long run, what's going to happen? Well, this demand increase caused positive profits. What will firms do? Firms would then enter that market until the new equilibrium is at the same price as it was before. So it's going to lower that price so that the optimal quantity that each firm is producing is going to go back to whatever it was before. But the quantity in the market will now be higher. Why? Because even though each firm, once firms enter, is back to producing the same quantity they were before the demand increase, we now have more firms. So that same quantity times a higher number of firms would result in a larger market quantity. Okay, so this was kind of my market depiction down here. And that wasn't part of the question, but we could kind of add that in, that even from short run demand increases, the long run is always going to be where we have zero economic profits. Okay. All right. We then have one where I do have now not a demand change, but let's say that they're able to change their or lower their marginal cost and their average total costs. So in the short run, each firm is going to produce what? Well, we already kind of walked through this one, but if we see a decrease in the marginal and average total cost curve, what's that going to look like? So, and let's here start out. So I've got in my black marker, sorry. So if initially I was starting out. So here's my marginal cost. Here's my average total cost. And we could start out with, can't remember if I did this on it. Let's just start out with same kind of setup as the previous problem. Let's say initially I had an optimal quantity for the firm where profits are equal to 0. Okay. If they're able to lower their marginal costs, and subsequently I'll try to draw this the same parallel shift in average total, their average total cost, we said, well, what's going to be true? The quantity that the firm is going to produce will now be higher. Right? And what's going to happen in the short run? Well, at this new quantity, price is above my new average total costs. So profits are now positive. However, that's not the answer to this question, right? Because the question asks what happens in the short run to the quantity. Okay, that's going to be an increase. But what's happening, not in the short run, but what's happening to long run profits? First of all, we don't have to draw it out. Long run profits should always be 0. So this should be that each firm produces a higher quantity, right, in the short run, but that if firms can enter and exit, we'll get long run profits driven down to 0. What's that going to look like? Well, if there's positive profits, we said as firms enter this market, that pushes the equilibrium price down. So similar to when we had a demand increase, if we see a kind of cost structure decrease, both cause positive profits. Both we should see that firms enter that market, push the price down. In this case, they would push it all the way down to here. Actually, I should use 3 here. To where we are now at the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at the very lowest point of our new average total cost curve. So notice, initially, firms would produce a lot more units when they're able to lower their cost structure. But as firms enter the market, the quantity each firm is producing will be a little bit lower. Now, it's still greater than it was before they had that cost structure movement, but not quite as high as it was in the short run. So in the long run, as long as firms can enter, we'll still get driven back down to this point where price is equal to average total cost, or our profits are equal to 0 again. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So that should do it for the quiz. So we'll get that submitted. Everything looks good. And then the other thing I wanted to show you was go to the home page, scroll down to module 10. I've got this Excel file. So we're going to download this real quick. I just want to kind of show you a few things. First of all, it might be helpful, if you're going to want to be in the business world, I think at some point I would highly recommend brushing up on not only Excel, but probably other statistical packages. So I'll kind of give you an example of Excel, and I have the original here. I'm just going to copy and paste this to a different sheet because I want to do some things without changing it. I guess I got to enable editing first. There we go. All right. So these are representing, anytime I have parentheses in Excel, these represent negative values. We'll kind of walk through this here in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my total costs column, and let's say all I gave you were these total costs. Okay. I had some actual formulas behind the scenes in the other file, but I don't want to use that here. So let's say I didn't give you any other information other than your total costs, right? And here I'll actually even delete profit column. So I'm going to delete this as well. All right. So I have the same number here, and it was supposed to match up with what I had here. I'm going to use some cell references to kind of show you how you would do this in Excel. So this kind of lines up with, it's just more options. the kinds of questions you could be asked here in the practice problems if I just gave you total cost. And I'd probably be a little more friendly on like the quiz or the exam. I'd give you total cost and total variable costs. Okay? But I'll kind of show you all you really need is the total cost and the price of a good to determine the profit maximizing quantity as well as the profit. Okay. So make sure we can kind of read all these here. So if I wanted to find marginal revenue, right, that should simply be, I've got this cell over here that has the price of the good. So originally I had it set to be $2 and what, 2.225. So that's why I kind of rounded to the second decimal. Looked like it was 2.23. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller just for the sake of what we're doing. I think we know that MR means marginal revenue. So this is always going to be cell J1. So I'm going to use some fancy dollar sign. This is just some Excel stuff. Basically, I know that my price is always going to be my marginal revenue. What is my total revenue? Well, that's always just going to be what's the price of the good multiplied by the quantity I'm selling. Now in Excel, when I copy this down, this is nice because it takes the new price of the good times the number of the good I'm selling. Now I've got my total revenues and my total costs. How can I find profits? Profits are simply going to be take my total revenue, subtract my total costs. It doesn't like this one because this should technically be a 0, right? Copy this down. Now at every single quantity, it's taking my total revenue minus my total costs, and kind of see here already, what is the optimal quantity going to be? Well, if this was the kind of current price, you can see here that, okay, the optimal quantity actually at 8, I'd be earning just as the same amount of profits as if I shut down. So what should this price be? What should our shutdown rule mean? Oh, that was when price was equal to the minimum of our average variable cost. So hopefully when we build out the average variable cost, we find that the minimum is actually what? Right at 2.225. Well, we got to do a little more work before we can get there. So what would be my marginal cost? Right? So marginal costs are just taking the change in my total cost. So we'll have to use some parentheses here, but my new total cost minus my old total cost. Now, I don't have to use cell references here. I know the change in quantity is always 1 here, but I'm just going to select the values just in case I wanted to change them to like 10, 20, 30, and 40. So this should calculate my marginal cost, right? So if I was just given the total cost and the quantity, I can calculate that marginal cost column. Now, what is my average total cost? That was simply going to be my total costs divided by quantity. So once again, similar to the practice quiz problems, you could build your average total cost column for that smaller table as well. It's just going to take a little bit more time because you can't copy this down like you can in Excel, and it does the math for you. You just have to do it by hand. Okay. Now, if I wanted to know my total variable cost, what is that always going to be in this example? Well, whatever my total costs are, minus, how do I know my fixed costs? If I produce nothing, all of my costs must be fixed. So in this example, my fixed cost would be 6. Now I can do a fancy thing as well, where I select the column where I had fixed costs, and then what I do, freeze that cell reference. So when I copy this down, it'll just keep using that value of 6. So I can go through, basically, how do I find variable costs? I just take my total cost and subtract my fixed cost. How do I know my fixed costs? Whatever my total costs are at a quantity of 0, that represents my fixed costs. Okay. Well, I've only got one more thing left. How do I find average variable cost? It's just my total variable cost divided by the quantity I'm producing. So I can do that for every single quantity here pretty quickly in Excel. Once again, I could do that here. It would just take a little bit more time to kind of do each one of these hand by hand, or hand by hand, line by hand, right? So I want to point out a couple things here. Now there's some rounding issues, but you can kind of notice that lowest point of my average variable cost was right at 2.22. It rounds to 3, but 2.225. So that's the lowest point of my average variable cost. If the price ever goes above that, so let's say it was 2.5. What should be true is if the price is above the lowest point of my average variable cost, the optimal decision, the optimal quantity should be somewhere where I choose to stay open and minimize my losses because price is above that lowest point of my average variable cost. So if I go through this here, where is my marginal cost? The last time it's, excuse me, less than that marginal revenue or that price of 250 would be right here at a quantity of 8. So sure enough, if I'm producing at that optimal quantity of 8, my losses are 3.8. That's the lowest negative value here for profits. That's going to be where profits are maximized. And that's a smaller loss than if I simply just produce nothing and shut down. Now I also could say, okay, what if the price went above, or sorry, let's do below. Let's do $2. Well, if my price is below the lowest point of my average variable cost, what should be true is now at the optimal profit maximizing quantity, if I stay open, my losses will be greater than $6 if I just shut down. So now if I put 2 in here and I can do all these calculations, where is the last quantity where that price is above my marginal cost? So it looks like it would actually be at a quantity of 7. I'd be indifferent at a quantity of 8 because marginal cost would be equal to the price of 2. So notice there my losses are $7.80. Yeah, I'd just be better shutting down. Anytime that price falls below that minimum point of my average variable cost, I'd just be better off shutting down. Okay. Now, what if the price goes up to $4? Well, before I was looking at prices where I had the price set below the lowest point of my average total. So notice the lowest point of my average total cost is 2.96. So if I was at $4, right, where would the last quantity be? Either the marginal cost is less than or equal to 4. It would be right here at a quantity of 10. So notice as the price goes up, the optimal quantity for the firm, just like when we drew it out, also goes up. Now my profits are at their highest point, right, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And because that price is now above that minimum point of my average total cost curve, I know that I'm going to have positive profits. Let's say it was exactly equal to that minimum point. What should be true about my profits when they're maximized? They should be 0. Now the rounding, it's a little bit off here because it rounds things to the second decimal, but you can kind of see when my price is equal to the lowest possible average total cost at that profit maximizing quantity, or where profits are highest, I'm right at $0. Like I said, probably technically this is probably supposed to be like what, 2.9, so that 55 or something, like, no, it must be 2.965. I don't know. Right? There's going to be out to some decimal value. Now, when we had the price of 4, we said our profits were highest at quantity. What if the price goes up to 8? Well, we should now see an even higher quantity. And where is profits maximized? So it's at a higher quantity, 12 instead of 10 now, and the value of profits is even larger than before. So we can kind of play around with this. All the visuals really could be looked at in table form. And this is just a way to kind of showing you how you could do some of this in Excel. Okay. Let me think. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to point out here. So let's go back to that price of 4, just to kind of have some more interesting values. I could also calculate my profits as the quantity I'm producing times what? The difference between my price, and really price is always here, so I'm going to use this one, and my average total cost. So notice, even if I do total revenue minus total cost, or I use the other form of the profit equation, I should end up with the exact same values for profit. Okay. It's just kind of showing you, solidifying that idea. I didn't just make those equations up. The math will kind of hold, kind of supporting the algebra that I did. Okay. All right. So all of that kind of discussion really is like would apply to these types of questions. You would just only have what, 6 different quantities you have to do this for. So on the quiz or the exam, I'd only give you 5 or 6 kind of different output levels. And usually one of those would include 0. So, finding the average variable cost and things at 0 is easy. You really only have to do this for kind of 5 different outputs. And I'm not going to be changing the price on you as much. By each problem here, I kind of have its own set price. All right. So that was kind of that Excel file that we took a look at. I will get that module 10 quiz posted right now. So if I wouldn't suggest maybe jumping right into it. Maybe look over the materials a little bit, study before you take it, but it should now be available. That module 11 reading is due before we start class tomorrow. And we in fact got through just as much as I did with my other section. So I'll just post this recording. I will get down here tomorrow to make sure that, and I should probably send an email to the building people to make sure that they've got this workstation going correctly so we can start right at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Okay. All right. End the recording there.